It's my very great pleasure to welcome our next talk from Heather Browning, Dr. Heather Browning. Heather is a postdoctoral research officer in animal sentience and welfare at the London School of Economics as part of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project. Her primary research interests are animal welfare, ethics, and consciousness. She completed her PhD at the Australian National University with a dissertation on the measurement of animal welfare. She has also worked for many years as a zookeeper and zoo animal welfare officer, interested in the application of animal welfare measurement. And Heather, your talk today is called Constructing Animal Affect Profiles. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Fantastic.
Can you get me to share my screen?
Yes. Ali, do you want to make...
That was not the right button. Okay. Let's try this.
Perfect.
All right. Excellent. All right. I've got everything on. Yep. Okay, yeah. So thanks everyone for coming along today. So I'm going to be talking about some work that's fairly new. It's sort of, I guess, some thoughts I've been having that I'm now trying to cohere into some sort of semblance of a reasonable whole. So I'm interested to get feedback on what people think of this. And yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about here is constructing affect profiles for different animals as a way of thinking about their sentience. So typically when we're thinking about research into animal consciousness or animal sentience, one of the main questions that's being asked is questions of distribution. So sort of, looking at these taxonomic trees, and people are interested in which of these animals are sentient and which are not. And basically it's going around, drawing circles around different parts. And these boundaries seem to be pushing out ever further. So, there's, I guess, different controversies at different times. For a while it was fish. I think the balance of consensus has gone in the way of them now. And now sort of, cephalopods and decapods are on the table. And I think other kinds of arthropods, insects and mollusks are probably on the table next. And so there's just this question that we're asking about, are these animals sentient? And this is often used then when we figure out that an animal is sentient, this grounds their kind of ethical consideration or their inclusion in policy. And so I guess a little self-promotionally here, but you may have seen over last week that we put out, so my team working at the LSE, the review of evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans, where we reviewed a whole bunch of scientific research to try and figure out whether there was strong evidence that these animals were sentient. And based on the recommendations of this report, the legislation, the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill, has now included them for protection. And this seems quite common within legislation across the world now, that the sentience of different animals is being used to include their protection and protection for their welfare. So this question is often quite important. The other area where these sorts of things come up, this is sort of, I guess, an emerging research area as well, is the questions of welfare comparisons. So there are a lot of different reasons we want to compare the welfare of different species, in particular if we want interventions between different animals. So say we've got some money to spend and we want to figure out where it would be best used. Would we be better off improving the lives of factory farmed chickens or salmon? And this requires us to make comparisons of the welfare of these different animals. And very often these kinds of comparisons are thought of as comparing the relative level of sentience of these different animals, like how intense the experience of a cow versus a salmon really is. So this is often written up as something like a sentience multiplier or a welfare capacity. And I've just put an example here. That's a table that's used in one of these sort of effective altruism kind of forums where they take a whole bunch of different pieces of data to try and calculate what is the amount of suffering caused, in different production systems. But one of the important things that is used in here is this sentience multiplier. You can see that they try and figure out relative to usually a standard point of a human, how sentient are these different animals, and then you weight their suffering accordingly. And this is usually taken to be some function of, brain size, number of neurons, complexity of the connections of these neurons or something like that. But it's very much a sort of a scale, a continuum, the idea that, you've got some amount of, an animal with the maximum amount of sentience, the maximum intensity of experience, all the way through to animals that have a much more sort of faded type of experience. And then this can be used again to guide decisions about different policies or different kinds of charitable giving. So the thing that we're interested in here particularly is affective sentience. So some people use the word sentience just to mean this kind of valenced experience. I take it that sentience can include perhaps non-valent states, at least in theory, but it is this capacity for the positively and the negatively valenced mental states that animals have. That's what's of interest when we're talking about these things. And they're often called feelings or affects. And there's a whole range of different things that animals can have. So they can be hungry, they can feel pain, they can be curious, like these little birds here. They can have thermal comforts, resting comforts, this whole different range of kind of feelings, these affects. And this kind of puts together gives us the sentient experience of the animal. And I mean, some people have argued that this kind of valence experience is actually the more fundamental form of consciousness over sort of perceptual ones. So some recent work, I mean, yeah, Pansep for a very long time has sort of talked about these core emotion systems. Mark Soames recently released a book where he's talking about this. David Miller, who's a welfare scientist, is very interested in this kind of, he calls welfare-aligned sentience, which is this affective sentience. Whether or not it turns out that this is, you know, the fundamental form of consciousness, it's still certainly one of the very fundamental forms of consciousness, and so still important for that kind of reason. But I guess what I'm thinking about when I'm putting this together is that this idea of thinking about sentience, you know, as a presence or absence or a continuum is perhaps not the most useful way of thinking about it. And so rather than thinking of consciousness as a scale, we need to consider its dimensions. And this is something that my colleague Jonathan Birch and some collaborators wrote a paper on recently, where they were talking about, you know, constructing these kind of consciousness profiles for different animals. And here's an example here of, you know, they've just kind of hypothesized what it might look like for some different species based on their performance along a bunch of different dimensions of, you know, unity, selfhood, perceptual richness, evaluative richness. So something like this model seems important, rather than just thinking of consciousness as, you know, something the animal has or doesn't have, or something that goes along a continuum, that it can be more or less along a range of different dimensions. So when we're thinking of this kind of approach, what we're really emphasizing are the features and the varieties of the experience of an animal. It's not just, you know, more or less, but it's what is it like to be an animal, you know, taking this famous kind of Thomas Nagel approach to it. You know, when we're thinking about the dimensions of its consciousness, we're getting a much better idea of, you know, what it is actually like to be this animal and the different dimensions along which it can vary. And this seems particularly important if we start thinking in a more gradualist way about the emergence of consciousness. So I think it's becoming much more common for us to think about consciousness as something that does emerge really gradually. It's not something that an animal necessarily has or doesn't have. You know, it's an evolved phenomenon, and like a lot of different evolutionary things, there may not be a sharp transition between when an animal definitely has it and when they definitely don't. And we might see some kinds of like quasi-consciousness along the scale here. And when we think of the dimensions of consciousness, it may make it a bit easier to conceptualize this. A lot of people have a problem with this gradualist approach precisely because it's very difficult to think about, you know, consciousness feels like you either something that it's like or there is not. But when you think that there's all these different dimensions among, there can be something that it is more or less like, it starts becoming, I guess, less obvious that there is this kind of binary distinction. And you can think of animals that have a more limited range of experience, more limited intensities of experience, that, you know, when this narrows down, it sort of starts shading through into these kind of quasi states. So with all this in mind, what I'm particularly interested is in the range of affects. So pulling all that together, we've got this idea of dimensions of consciousness with this importance of sort of affective sentience. And so I think, you know, the Birch approach, which looks at this kind of range of dimensions of consciousness, has this one strand of evaluative richness that kind of touches on the affective range. But coming from my welfare science background and thinking about this affective sentience, I think it's really important that we start considering what the range of affects that an animal experiences is. And in particular, you know, at the moment, I'll show in a second, but there's work that sort of looks at particular affects, trying to use that as a smoking gun evidence that an animal is or is not sentient. But I think we have to be very careful at thinking that just because an animal has or lacks one particular affect doesn't really tell us anything about what other affects it may have or not have and whether or not it is sentient. So the example here, and this is kind of what I guess started me thinking about this whole thing, was the way people sometimes talk about insects in this space. So there's at least, you know, some evidence from, I guess, some fairly old papers now that insects don't feel pain. And, you know, this came from some early work that showed that cockroaches didn't seem to show behavioral responses. They didn't show self-grooming, that sort of thing, when they were injured or when they lost limbs. And so this was taken as evidence that they don't feel pain, because if they felt pain, they should have these behavioral responses. I think more recent work, particularly with one of the sort of friends of our team, Tilda Givens, is doing some work on pain experience in bees. And she seems to find, at least for bees, they do actually show these kinds of behaviors. They show wound tending, they show motivational trade-offs in the face of damaging stimuli, this kind of thing. So it probably isn't the case that insects don't feel pain, but used as an example, when people take this assumption, when they think that insects don't feel pain, they use this as evidence that insects don't have an evaluative form of sentience. And so Peter Godfrey-Smith particularly has kind of written on this and used this as an example because he pulls apart this perceptual and this evaluative side of consciousness. And he sort of describes insects as something that might have a perceptual consciousness while lacking the evaluative consciousness. And that seems to me to be, I guess, a slightly strange way to think about it, because pain is only one of a potentially huge range of affects. And even if it does turn out that insects lack pain, there's no reason for us to think that they don't have all these other things. So yeah, this is when I started really thinking that what's important is to start mapping out what the range of affects an animal might have, rather than looking for, presence or absence and just making broad assumptions based on that. So we can think that, different animals have vastly different physiologies, vastly different lifestyles. And for that reason, we should expect them to have different sets of affects and experienced to different degrees. So, an animal might have, out of the total set of a huge number of different affects, they will have some subset of those. And this is going to be based on what's useful for them, what kind of lifestyle they have, what sorts of things are their most strong motivators within their life. And so we might think, these are just completely hypothesized, these aren't based on any data, but, something like a caterpillar, which is very, strongly shaping its life around essentially collecting nutrients to grow and eventually transform, might have something like hunger and thirst as its primary motivating drives. An earthworm that's moving through soil perhaps has primarily pressure sensations to help guide its movement. Some other animals may have complex aesthetic pleasures. And this is a story that's almost certainly not true, but I've heard some zookeepers claim that wombats, and put it on the picture here, wombats really enjoy watching the sunrise, they say. And so a lot of zookeepers think that, it's very important that a wombat has a space that it can get up high and watch the sun rise and set from its enclosure. Now, not so certain that wombats have the aesthetic pleasure to enjoy the sunrise or sunset, but again, this is the type of affect that different animals might have and the type of things we can investigate. And so I guess what we're sort of thinking of here is just a methodological shift, moving away from these kind of current methods that really focus strongly on these perceptual or cognitive indicators that are derived from human studies. It's very, very common at the moment for studies on consciousness to essentially take humans, look at what things they can do consciously and which things they can't do consciously, and then look at animals and see, can they do these same things? And if they can, they must be conscious. I think there's a whole lot of other problems with, the validity of shifting these things across from humans to animals. That's not really relevant here. But even if we took that, we still don't get any information at all on what the type of experience that animal has is like. At the very least, we can say it must have some kind of consciousness or sentience, but we don't know any more than that. And that's not going to help us in a lot of situations. And so when I'm thinking about how we do this, it's a much more kind of bottom-up approach where we would develop different sets of indicators for the different affects that an animal might have. And these would be developed and sort of based on our knowledge of the evolutionary functions of different affects and our knowledge of the mechanisms by which they operate in different animals. So it's sort of grounded in our best available theory at the time. And that means that this can grow and change as we learn more about animals. But it shouldn't be the case that, we need this sort of, definitive proof, or this, certainly validated indicators. If we do have our best available theory supporting the sets of indicators that we've built, that gives us at least some reason to be confident in them. And the validation problem, so this is, I think, the biggest problem with this kind of approach is to make sure that we do have valid sets of indicators. And here the big challenge is to overcome what I've said is the problem of non-conscious affect. So right now, when we're thinking about affects, we think about, say, hunger. It's entirely possible and it's probably likely that something like many of the functions of hunger and many of the mechanisms by which hunger operates are non-conscious, even though we experience it consciously and it does work for us in that way. In other animals, that may not be the case. And so we need ways of differentiating between conscious and non-conscious affect. And the validation of these kinds of indicators is something I'm working on, I guess, in a separate kind of project. But to sketch out roughly what we're going to be needing then is to use something like this robustness approach, sort of this Wimsattian model, where we're thinking about clusters of markers, where we have multiple lines of evidence that are independent, that all point at the same conclusion, are going to be much stronger for us than any single marker. And so, when we think about things that we're more likely to see in an animal that's conscious than one that's got non-conscious affect, and we start building a large profile of these, we reach a point where the best explanation for our observed patterns is going to be that we have the kind of target system that we're hypothesizing. So, if you've got one line of evidence that points at that, that's easily defeasible. You got 2 or 3, it starts becoming less likely that each are independently defeasible because they're all different. And the more of these you add, the less likely it is that each of them has malfunctioned in exactly the same way to point you in the wrong direction. And here, I've put, it's really important to have independence of background assumptions, because obviously if you've got a set of indicators that all rely on the same background assumptions, they could all fail in the same way. And so having multiple isn't going to help you any more than having 1 or 2. But if they've got independent background assumptions, then like I said, you start the likelihood of each of them failing in the exact same direction and still pointing you at the same thing becomes less and less likely. So an example here of thinking about how this works comes from the current work that is being done on, I guess, the one affect that is being quite well studied in animals, and that is pain. So when we think about animal pain, there's a huge range of indicators that are used to determine the presence of pain experience. And here they are dealing with this problem of non-conscious affect because they think about nociception, which is the non-conscious processing of noxious stimuli. And all the work in determining whether or not animals experience pain is essentially looking for this, looking for the differences between nociception and actual conscious pain experience. And here are some of the animals that this work has been sort of focused on recently: fishes, cephalopods, decapods. But importantly, they are using big ranges of indicators. No one's just trying to find, one line of evidence that's used as sort of a proof that animals can or cannot feel pain, but we bring together a range of indicators that are physiological and behavioral. So here are a list of the sorts of things that we look for. Physiologically, we look for the presence of nociceptors because although they're not sufficient for pain experience, they certainly seem to be necessary. You look for integrative brain regions to which those nociceptive signals bring this information together with other parts of other inputs from the body. Endogenous neurotransmitters for mediating these kinds of pain experiences and for offsetting, so like, endogenous analgesics. And also a whole range of behavioral indicators as well. My computer's going to this over here there. So looking at animals that show a behavioral response to anesthetics or analgesics, that demonstrate that they value anesthetics or analgesics by, self-dosing or by working to gain access to spaces where they can have these things, showing motivational trade-offs between different kinds of experience. I put here pictures of hermit crabs because Bob Elwood's work on the motivational trade-offs of hermit crabs between the quality of shell and the pain experience by getting a shock in a different shell, show really interesting kind of, I guess, support for the idea that animals are making these complex trade-offs, which is support for the idea they're conscious, flexible, self-protective behavior like guarding injured limbs or grooming and rubbing them, and the ability to do complex associative learning with different kinds of stimuli. Again, none of these single lines of evidence would necessarily be sufficient, but taken together, they create a picture in which it seems like the best explanation for seeing positives in all these different areas is that an animal has pain experience. We can construct these kind of complex descriptions of all kinds of other processes that are happening to create each of these things. But at some point, it just seems simpler to say, well, look, it's all just coming out of this one core experience. And so I think, using this example of pain is a really good way of thinking about how we could go about investigating other affects. Pain's been used primarily because it is really important ethically, but there are all these other kinds of affects now that we can start thinking about and start trying to respond to in this kind of way. There we go. So I think when we're extending the approach across a range of affects, we can start building an affect profile. And this is a picture here. This is obviously from some human work on different emotions. It's not the kind of thing that I necessarily think that you'd be constructing for animals, but you could get something that looks sort of like this. You've got a whole range of different affects, and an animal could experience them to a greater or lesser degree. And you can start building this profile, looking, where are the spikes? How much of this space does it occupy? And so the question becomes less, is this animal sentient, but what is its sentient experience actually like? What are the dimensions of it? What are the things that it feels most strongly? What are the things that it doesn't feel at all? And then this can guide the way that we treat them and the way that we consider them. Obviously, the way that we think about these animals, the kinds of sentience they have, is going to be really important for the ways that and then we figure out what's wrong with them. So an animal, for instance, that doesn't feel any pain, so say again, if insects didn't feel pain, then it may be the case that our ethical treatment of insects wouldn't have to include concern for causing them pain, but it still may have to include concern for causing them extreme hunger or thermal discomfort or any of these sorts of other things that they may be able to experience there. So yeah, what we're going to do is something like studying the features of each affect, looking for their presence or absence, looking for how strong the feeling is, and this might be kind of relative to the other affects that the animal has, how much of its kind of total motivational state is explained by different affects. For some animals, like I said, hunger may be really, really important. For some, pain or fear must be much more important. For some positive states, like the search for exploration might be important too. And we also think about the contexts in which these are experienced. So, which conditions the animals need to have or not have in order to have the positive or remove the negative affects. So to wrap up, I think the affect profiles, if we can create something like that, are going to provide us with a better understanding of what it's like to be different animals. So rather than just, are they sentient? Are they non-sentient? We start thinking about how are they sentient? What are the experiences of them? And this importantly allows us to tailor our considerations for them and pay proper attention to their interests in terms of, like our ethical decisions, in terms of like policy making, the husbandry of captive animals, what conditions do we need to provide for them? How do we intervene for wild animals, etc. And so, not necessarily that this is an approach that needs to replace the current ones, but certainly to complement it, to make sure that we've got everything we need to be considering these animals in a way that matters to them. All right, thank you. I'll take any questions.